I'd like to read an article to you that appeared in a fairly recent issue of the Wall Street Journal. An Orthodox Jew who is a member of the hereditary Kohanim, that means a priest. By the way, if you a Jew who has the name Kohan, whether it's spelled with a C or a K or Kun or anything derived similar to that, is a descendant of the priest. The Hebrew word for priest is Kohan, and the Jews who carry that name in various alternate spellings trace their descent from the house of Aaron. Anyway, the article says, an Orthodox Jew who is a member of the hereditary Kohanim, or priest caste, boards an El Al jetliner heading for Jerusalem. Looking out the window, he sees a coffin being loaded into the plane's hold. He bolts from the seat and rushes off the aircraft. The problem? Well, Jewish religious law forbids a priest, a Kohen, from being in the same room or enclosure with a dead body. And for El Al, Israel's national airline, which carries dead bodies of many observant Jews to be buried in Israel, that's a problem. So in 1986, El Al came here to New York to a small stucco building on the city's outskirts that houses the Institute for Science and Halakha, which is the Hebrew name for the religious law. 15 engineers and religious scholars labor to find ways to reconcile modern technology and halakha, the 3,500-year-old body of Jewish religious law. After delving into the Torah and other texts, the group solved El Al's problem. The airline now encases coffins in cardboard containers. Halakha says this gives each coffin its own house, as long as it's made of forest products. So they solve that. They're not in the same building or room with a dead body, because they've created a house for the coffins. So the coffin's in a different house, so they just go ahead and get on the airline and fly right on. Many of the puzzlers concern the Sabbath, when the Torah bars observant Jews from performing certain kinds of labor and expending energy. Now, the Talmud forbids 39 different kinds of work on the Sabbath. You see, in the Old Testament, God says you are to remember the Sabbath, you're to keep it holy, on it you are to do no work. It says the Sabbath is a day that we're to abstain from work. Now, the question came up during the time between the Testaments, as the religious groups that Jesus Christ encountered in his day, the Pharisees, Sadducees, various ones were shaping up. The question came up, all right, we're not supposed to work. What is work? What is work? Well, they concocted a list of 39 different kinds of work, all of which were prohibited. Now, from that list of 39, which they themselves came up with, trying to define work, they have continued to, everything falls under, say, one of those 39. So they come up with all these things. Now, let me read you some of the problems they've come up with. The 39 different kinds of work. Observant Jews, for instance, cannot light a fire, which means in modern times they can't turn on a light, although they could have someone else turn it on for them. For a long time, they couldn't travel in elevators. That problem has been solved after heroic work at the Institute by its founder, Rabbi Levi Yitzhak Halperin. The Institute's technicians have, among other things, helped a major Israeli appliance maker design the Sabbath-observing Galaxy refrigerator. It features a microchip that can be programmed so that on the Sabbath the compressor and motor operate automatically rather than when the door is open. Because you see, they did all this figuring and they decided, every time we open the door to the refrigerator, this causes the light to come on and the generator to run, which means, in effect, we are turning on a motor. So we're doing work. We can't open the door to the refrigerator because we're going to be causing the generator to run, the light to come on. That's going to be drawing all this electric current. We're going to be causing it, so it can't do that. So some enterprising Jew developed a little microchip that causes the programs to where on the Sabbath the compressor runs automatically, whether you open the door or not. So therefore you can open the door and you're not causing the thing to run. So they've come a way around it, you see. In the Institute's cramped office, yarmulke-clad engineers hunch over computer screens, studying columns of numbers. On the walls hang models of past triumphs, such as the Sabbath telephone, used, among others, by former Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. On a regular phone, pressing a button creates a current, thus the problem of using energy on the Sabbath. The Sabbath telephone, however, has a continuous stream of current that the user interrupts in order to operate and dial. So you see, you're not expending energy, you're actually causing energy not to be expended. The person behind all of this, Rabbi Halperin, is a sixth-generation Israeli with a flowing white beard that makes him look like an Old Testament prophet. He founded the Institute 30 years ago, gathering top scientists and scholars of the religious law to help him make the Torah living law. Over the years, he has written such tomes as Heating of Water on the Sabbath, Electricity in the Religious Law, Purity of Gates. This last is about problems concerning hospitals with in the religious law. In a hospital, for instance, certain record keeping on the Sabbath would violate halakha rules against unnecessary writing. Jewish law defines writing as making a permanent mark. So the Institute came up with an ink that is illegible when it is used, or that is legible. You can see it when it's used, but it disappears after 3 days. Therefore, it did not make a permanent mark, and in the 3 days that transpire, you have time to recopy it. So they figured a way around that. Now, to the uninitiated, such solutions sometimes look like clever end runs around the religious law. But, no. Religious experts support Rabbi Halperin's credibility in the Institute's work. Nothing has so captivated theological concern as the problem of the elevator. It's a pressing question in Israel, where the suburbs of Tel Aviv and Jerusalem are filled with apartment blocks. It is central to the problem of modern life. After 17 years of research, Rabbi Halperin is probably the world's leading authority on how to make elevator use on the Sabbath permissible under the religious law. He has written a 200-page book on this subject, complete with diagrams. Automation solved the obvious problem of pushing the buttons. Elevators simply stop at every floor on the Sabbath. Solves that problem. Going up is no problem. People just step in and out without doing anything or making any demands on energy. But there is a problem with going down. Millions of elevator riders are not aware of this, but Rabbi Halperin learned that if the elevator and its passengers weigh more than the elevator's counterweight, then an automatic restraining system slows it, preventing it from plummeting to the ground. In most elevators, this action creates energy. In most efficient buildings, that energy usually is channeled through electrical wires or power other functions in the building. Thus, he concluded, by stepping into a down elevator on the Sabbath, an Orthodox Jew is directly contributing to the creation of energy. It may be turning on lights or operating machines, all things forbidden by the religious law. What to do? Well, the Institute's engineers designed a system that automatically prevents this new energy from being used elsewhere on the Sabbath. Such elevators are now widely used in Jerusalem. So, anyway, you now have the inside track on what is needed for the observance of the Sabbath. Or do you? You know, Jesus Christ encountered, these are simply modern examples of many of the things that Jesus Christ encountered when he walked the earth almost 2,000 years ago, because it is the descendants of the Pharisees, those who accused Jesus Christ of breaking the Sabbath, that we read of right here. This article taken from a December 3rd issue of the Wall Street Journal. The extremes that sometimes are gone to, now you may not have realized it, but you see just in coming here on the Sabbath, according to the reasoning of many of these, you broke the Sabbath in all sorts of ways. Getting in a car and driving, that would come under the classification. If you turned on your lights or plugged in your coffee percolator or whatever you did, all kinds of things that come in. Now, that obviously represents one extreme. This was the extreme that was promulgated by the Pharisees in the days of Jesus Christ. This sort of thing, these are simply some modern examples, but they had others that were just as ludicrous. They started out, you see, with the premise when the law said, don't work on the Sabbath. So they said, all right, what's work? Well, harvesting is work. Any of you who've ever farmed, you could agree with that. I've taken part in some harvesting before, and that can be pretty hard work. All right, no problem. Harvesting is work. All right, what is harvesting? So then they had to do a little thinking on that. And they said, well, what if you plucked off one ear of grain? Would that be harvesting? Well, no, that maybe wouldn't be harvesting. What if you plucked off two? Now we're getting into harvesting. What if you, now not only is harvesting work, but threshing is also work. Now if any of you have ever been involved in threshing, you could agree with that. Threshing is work. You put in all right, well, what is threshing? Well, this is what they nailed Christ and the disciples on. You remember when Jesus made the walk there from Bethany into Jerusalem, which is less than a mile. It's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 0.8 of a mile, something like that, just a little short distance. They were coming in, and it says they were going through a grain field. Now, of course, most roads were not roads as we think of them. Most of the roads were more of footpaths, because that was the way people got where they were going. Some of you, who are a little older can perhaps remember when there were a lot of roads around that weren't much more than footpaths. There were, of course, more major roads on which major transit was, but in a lot of cases, there was a little pathway that kind of connected up the back way where you could cut through. And this is the way, of course, many of the roads were, not the major Roman roads, but little pathways. And it was nothing more than a footpath that would cut through, for instance, in this case, a grain field. And the disciples were walking with Jesus. They had spent the night in Bethany, were coming into Jerusalem to the temple. They were walking along, and they plucked off some of the ears of grain that were there, right up there by the roadside. They would pluck it off and rub it around in their hand to separate the grain from the head, and to separate it out and blow on it and blow the chaff away, and they would chew the wheat kernels. Now, this as they walked along, there are undoubtedly several that they plucked off. Now, this, in the eyes of the Pharisees, constituted a serious work. This was both harvesting and threshing. Because they were, here they were threshing because they separated the wheat from the chaff, and they harvested because they plucked more than one. Well, Jesus did not feel bound by their definition, because their definition did not come out of the Scriptures. It was out of their own human idea, their own human reasoning. They were not understanding of what is the spirit of the law, which is the intent of the law, the purpose of the law, the spiritual motivation behind the law. Their whole motive and intent was to reduce everything down to just every specific thing. And of course, when you take it out to an extreme, you wind up with all kinds of things, everything from needing an elevator that you don't have to push the button on to you name it. It becomes a major problem for some. Now, that is, of course, not what God had in mind. This was one extreme. It was prevalent among certain groups, certain sects of the Pharisees. And others, you think the Pharisees were the extremes, but there were some off-brand groups that were only peripherally connected with the Pharisees or the other Jews of Jesus' day, the Essenes and others, who had other restrictions that even went way beyond that. Just incredible, the kinds of things that they came up with, and some of the things that go on. The point being, is this what God intended when He talked about remembering the Sabbath and keeping it holy? Is that what He meant? You have, obviously, that is one extreme. You have the other extreme, which is far more prevalent today, just as it generally has been, which is an absolute disregard and careless regard for the Sabbath. A matter of taking the Sabbath for granted, of really treating the Sabbath scarcely different from any other day of the week. There are those who, in certain groups, that claim to keep the Sabbath. There's certain ones who observe the Sabbath about the same way that most Sunday professing Christians observe Sunday. And that obviously represents something else. Today, what I would like for us to do is to understand a little more clearly what God expects. Not what the Talmud lists, not the ideas of the Pharisees, not the attitudes that are prevalent in our society, but let's understand a little more clearly what God expects. In the book of Exodus, good place to start, because here we find the basic Sabbath commandment. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8. God says simply, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now that's the basic Sabbath command. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the eternal your God. In it you shall not do any work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, your manservant, nor your maidservant, nor your cattle, nor the stranger that is within your gates. For in 6 days the Eternal made heaven and earth, the sea and all that in them is. And He rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Eternal blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now, we're told here very clearly that we're to remember the Sabbath, we're to keep it holy, and we're told that in it we should not do any work. So there are three basic things that we would note here about the Sabbath, and I would like to break it down in those three categories. Here in Exodus 20, we're told to remember the Sabbath, we're told to keep the Sabbath holy, and we're told that in it we are not to do any work. It goes on with the stipulation here that the no work prohibition obviously extends to our household. Now the concept was normally of someone, it was not uncommon to have an extended family living there, generally to an agricultural society. So the prohibition against working on the Sabbath extended to those that you had. Not only were you not to do it, but you weren't to send others out to do the work that you yourself would have been doing. It was to be a day of rest, and that was to be allowed to your family. And even if you had a stranger who was there, you were not to take advantage of the fact that he didn't keep the Sabbath to say, well, you can get out and put in a good day's work on my farm today. I can't. I got to rest, but why don't you hitch up the horse and plow the back 40? No, you can't do that. It was to be a day of rest, and so it extended here to us and to that over which we have authority and control. That over which we have authority and control. There obviously, we can give some illustrations and examples later on to perhaps understand that a little more clearly. For instance, if you own a business, you have authority and control over it. If you are a shift supervisor or foreman for a company, you really don't have authority and control. You're not the one that sets the policy. Now, you may not show up, but in terms of of controlling what the men on your crew do. If the company says we're want these people here, or we're calling out overtime, or we're running a shutdown, or whatever it is, authority, the responsibility is for that over which we have control, that over which we have authority, over which we have the ultimate say, and we're responsible for what we do, and we're responsible for what those who answer solely to us do. In the sense that we are, if you own a farm, and it's your farm, who works and what they do is solely at your discretion. You have the ultimate say on that. Therefore, you're responsible for it. You work for someone else, you work for a company, you don't have the ultimate say. Whoever owns the company does. You have responsibility for what you do, but you don't have ultimate authority over what others do. God does not hold us responsible for what others do. He holds us responsible for what we do and for what we have control of. Now, let's notice three aspects. It says, remember the Sabbath day. It says, keep it holy. And it says, in it we're to do no work. Now what does he mean to remember the Sabbath day? You know, this is the only commandment that starts out with the words remember. Ironically, it is the one that people most commonly forget, and it's the only one God says to remember, which maybe ought to tell us something. You know, God says something, and it seems like people go to great effort to find out how to do the very opposite. He says, swear not at all, and people read that and say, well, I swear. I didn't know it said that. Just kind of one end to the other. If God says don't do it, people look to do it. If God says do it, people don't. So if God says remember, they forget. If God says be careful and don't forget this, then they do. So it's a matter that this is the way it seems to go. But he says, remember the Sabbath day. Now there are those who think the Sabbath was instituted by Moses. They think Moses invented the Sabbath. Well, Moses told them to remember it. Why did he tell them to remember it? You remember something that harkens back to the past. Well, in Genesis, at the time of creation, in chapter 1 and verse 31, we're told, God saw everything he had made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the sixth day. And in Genesis chapter 2, verse 1, it says, thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all the work which God created and made. So we find the Sabbath instituted at the time of creation. When God says in Exodus 20, told Israel to remember the Sabbath, he told them to look back and to remember something that had occurred in reality many centuries earlier. God had rested on the Sabbath. When the heavens and the earth were finished, when God finished the creation of the first 6 days of creation week, he said that he rested and he blessed that day. He sanctified it. He set it apart. He made it special. And he told later on in the Ten Commandments, which were spoken by the mouth of God from Mount Sinai, he said that Israel was to remember that day. And we find that the Sabbath was created when man was created. It was created at the time of man's creation. Now, back in the book of Mark chapter 2 and verse 23. It came to pass that he, Jesus, went through the cornfields or the wheat fields, the grain fields, on the Sabbath day. And his disciples began as they went to pluck the ears of grain. This is in the, as he is coming in coming in here to the city. His disciples, as they were walking along, plucked off some of the ears of grain. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? Now, what was not lawful about it was, according to the Pharisees, they were harvesting and threshing. And he said unto them, Jesus enjoyed really asking them questions that they liked to wrangle over every little technicality. They had no grasp of the spirit of the law. And so Jesus enjoyed asking them a question that they were going to have difficulty answering. They didn't understand. And he said, haven't you ever read what David did when he had need and he was hungry? Those that were with him? They went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, and they ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat, but for the priests. David ate it and gave also to them that were with him. Now, how do you explain that? If you go back, you can read the account in 1 Samuel of how David there had come to Nob, which is where the shrine was. Come to Nob, and they had no food. Well, normally every week the showbread was taken out of the tabernacle. It had been on display there from the previous Sabbath. The showbread, or the bread of presence, the 12 loaves that were there in the presence of God, these 12 unleavened loaves that were displayed there in the holy place, were taken out every Sabbath, replaced by fresh loaves, and then those loaves that were taken out were used by the priests. They were free to consume it, but it was not something that was normally dispensed out. It was not something that just anyone could partake of, because it was considered holy. It had been in the presence of God, it was taken out and they could use it. Now, it wasn't just any great, wonderful delicacy, because you take unleavened bread and let it set out for a week and eat it, you won't have just the most delicious of delicacies, but nevertheless, it was certainly usable and edible, and they were free to use it. But it was normally not dispensed out. But David came by, he and his group, and there was not anything there to eat. They were hungry. The showbread had been removed. It was, the priest didn't really have anything else there, and so they questioned David a little bit, made a judgmental decision to allow David and his men to eat of this bread that normally would not have been dispensed out, but they were hungry, and there was nothing else available. Now, the Pharisees would have had great problems with that, because they really didn't understand the spirit and intent of the law, and were so worried about every little picky technicality. So I'm sure that Jesus enjoyed asking them this question. They were probably huddled in great debates and discussions for hours afterward, trying to come up with an answer. You never read of an answer they gave him. They probably never were able to settle on an explanation. In fact, they may still be debating that particular verse that occurred. But anyway, Jesus asked them the question, and while they were in a huddle and weren't able to come up with an answer, he said unto them, verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. God didn't make the Sabbath and then create people to keep it. He created man, and then he made the Sabbath. The Son of Man also is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, if you want a day that's called the Lord's Day, this is the only day that is called the Lord's Day. Here in verse 28, he entered into the synagogue. And then they were watching him whether he would heal on the Sabbath. On down chapter 3, verse 2, there's a man with a withered hand. They knew the reputation for healing, and they were really watching because, see, this was against one of their 39 points. here that involved medical care, because this was not a life-threatening situation. This was not emergency first aid. The man's hand was withered, been withered for a long time. And I didn't say Christ went in and performed a 6-hour operation on the man's hand. It said that Jesus told the man to stretch forth the withered hand, and he told him that it was healed. And the man stretched out his hand and it was restored. There was not a lot of work and labor and energy expended. But the Pharisees were highly offended by that. Mark chapter 3. Highly offended. They took counsel with the Herodians, how they might destroy them. Now you know they were mad if they got together with the Herodians, because the Pharisees hated the Herodians. The Herodians were the group of Jews that were loyal to Herod. They were kind of the group that got along with Herod. Now Herod, the Pharisees did not like Herod. To begin with, Herod was a usurper. Herod was not even a Jew. He made at least some outward form of practicing the religion of the Jews, but really did not do so. He was an Edomite by birth, by ancestry, and had seized power with Roman help, and there had been a lot of intrigue, a lot of things going on that had enabled Herod to come to power. So the really religious Jews had no use for Herod, didn't like him at all, and who they hated worse than Herod was the Jews that tried to curry favor with him. Because you see, those were looked upon as traitors, as turncoats. No one is more looked down upon than those who who give the appearance of selling out their own group, their own people. Nobody is more despised than a turncoat or a traitor, a collaborator. This has been true basically in any culture. It was true with them. So the Pharisees and the Herodians were at absolute opposite ends. The Herodians were cooperators with Herod and with the Romans. And the Pharisees, of course, were absolutely opposed to that. But nevertheless, they were so outraged at Jesus Christ and what He did that they were ready to even patch things up and get together with their enemies, the Herodians, who really didn't make a whole lot of pretense of keeping the Sabbath, at least not in any way that the Pharisees would have recognized. But they got together. Now, here was their lack of understanding. Christ said that the Sabbath was made for man. We're told first and foremost we're to remember the Sabbath. What do we remember? Well, first thing we see here is the Sabbath was a memorial of creation. The Sabbath was made for man. We're to be conscious of the Sabbath. We're to remember the Sabbath. Let's notice Psalm 92. Psalm 92. Now, if you'll notice up above verse 1, in most Bibles, you'll have printed under the word Psalm 92, a psalm or song for the Sabbath day. This is part of the original text. It's not just an editor's comment. It was a descriptive term that was laid in. Now, here's a song or a psalm that was particularly designated as being for the Sabbath. Now, let's notice what it says. If we're to remember the Sabbath day, maybe there's some things here that give us some information to remember. We're told, it is a good thing to give thanks unto the Eternal and to sing praises unto your name, O Most High. To show forth your loving kindness in the morning, your faithfulness every night. Upon an instrument of 10 strings, upon the psaltery, upon the harp with a solemn sound. So here we find musical instruments, we find singing, we find this very sort of thing. That's why we, of course, open the Sabbath services with a song service. The Lord has made us glad through your work. You, Lord, have made us glad through your work. I'll triumph in the work of your hands. O Lord, how great are your works. Your thoughts are very deep. So the first emphasis here in this Sabbath psalm was an emphasis on the greatness of God's works. Now, the Sabbath is a memorial of creation. And when we observe the Sabbath, we look back to the fact that there was a creation and there is a creator. You know, an evolutionist has no basis to keep the Sabbath. Because an evolutionist doesn't believe what it says there in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. If there was not a creation week, and God did not rest on the seventh day, there is no basis for the Sabbath. The whole basis of sanctification of the Sabbath is that God sanctified it at creation. If there was not a creation, there is no Sabbath. So you can't be an evolutionist and keep the Sabbath because you have no basis for Sabbath keeping. The basis of Sabbath keeping is the fact that there is a creation, there is a creator, and that the Sabbath is a memorial of creation. That is all through the Scriptures. When we look back, all the way down even to the book of Hebrews, when we look back as to a basis for Sabbath keeping, we always go back to creation and the fact that God instituted it. It is a memorial of creation. So here the first thing that's focused upon here in Psalm 92 is that the Sabbath is a memorial of creation, God's great works, which He has done. Then notice what it says in verse 6. A brutish man knows not, neither does a fool understand this. When the wicked spring as the grass, and when all the workers of iniquity do flourish, it is that they shall be destroyed forever. It says here, look, you know, some people don't understand this, that you may look around and the wicked may be springing up like the grass. Now, grass is all over the place, and sometimes the wicked are just about as prevalent. He says, now what people that don't have understanding don't realize is when you look around and you see the wicked springing up like the grass and all the workers of iniquity flourishing, what you don't realize, what the man who lacks understanding doesn't realize is that they're going to be destroyed forever. You, Lord, are most high forevermore. For lo, your enemies, O Lord, your enemies shall perish. All the workers of iniquity shall be scattered. My horn shall you exalt like the horn of a unicorn. In other words, a horn is a symbol of power and authority. And a unicorn, of course, had one horn. So it says, my horn, my authority, shall you exalt. I shall be anointed with fresh oil. My eyes shall see my desire on my enemies. My ears shall hear my desire of the wicked that rise up against me. The righteous shall flourish like the palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those that be planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall still bring forth fruit in old age. They'll be fat and flourishing to show that the Eternal is upright. He is my rock. There's no unrighteousness in Him. Now, there are two things that are addressed in Psalm 92. One looks back as a memorial of creation. The other looks forward to the world tomorrow, a time when the government of God will be exalted and there will be no rivals, a time when the wicked will be removed away. So the Sabbath, we're told here in Psalm 92, if you go through and really study Psalm 92, a psalm or song for the Sabbath, two things stand out. Two things the Sabbath reminds us of. The Sabbath reminds us of the creative works that God accomplished in the past, and the Sabbath reminds us of the establishment of God's kingdom and God's government in the future. The Sabbath is a memorial that that testifies to the fact that God is creator, and it also testifies to the fact that as creator, He is going to rule His creation. He is going to judge the creation. He is going to establish His government. So when we're told to remember the Sabbath day, we are to be mindful of that which it pictures. Isaiah chapter 14 ties in with Psalm 92. Isaiah 14, verse 7. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Now the context here of Isaiah 14 is the time of the world tomorrow. The time of what we term the millennium. And it is a time where the whole earth is pictured as being at rest. It is a Sabbath, if you will. A time when there's a time of rest and quietness, a time of singing. That's why, now, millennium, of course, is a Latin word that means 1,000. We're told that there is a 1,000-year period. In the book of Revelation, the period is defined as 1,000 years. We're told about the period of the Messiah's rule on the earth. We're told about that period throughout the Scriptures. In the book of Revelation, it is defined as being precisely 1,000 years. Peter tells us that 1,000 years is with the Lord as a day. Isaiah tells us that the time of the Messiah's rule will be like a Sabbath, a time of a Sabbath for the whole earth, a time when the whole earth is at rest. Now we go back to the creation week and we find there were 6 literal days of work and a 7th day of the Sabbath. That set the stage for the week, which is a type of something, of a great plan and purpose God is working out. 1,000 years is in God's plan like one day. So you have 6 1,000-year days set apart for man, and a 7th 1,000-year day set apart that God reserves to Himself. A time when the whole earth will be at rest and is quiet. A millennial Sabbath, the time of the Messiah, a time when the wicked will no longer flourish and dominate. So when we're told to remember the Sabbath, we're told to look back and remember the creation and remember the Creator, remember the greatness and the power of God who brought what we see into being. We're told to look forward and to anticipate the reality of the establishment of the government of God. So we're told to remember the Sabbath, to be mindful, because the Sabbath is a memorial. It reminds us of God and the great plan that He has for mankind. The great Creator God, the judge and the ruler of His creation. Exodus 20 tells us we're to remember the Sabbath. We're to be conscious every week when the Sabbath comes. We're to be conscious of its meaning. That God gave us this day and He told us to remember it because it is a memorial. He also said, He said, not only remember the Sabbath day, which doesn't mean, oh, I remember, it's the Sabbath, and then going on about your business, you see. That's not exactly what it means, because He says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And keep it holy. So it doesn't mean that you're out mowing your yard and you say, oh, I remember, it's the Sabbath, and you keep on mowing your yard. Well, I remember the Sabbath day. I remember, it's the 7th day of the week. No, it says remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Now we get into something else. We're to keep it holy. What does that mean? Well, to be holy is to be sanctified by the presence of God. If we're to keep it holy, that means we're to keep it as a day dedicated to God. We're to keep it as a day that is God-centered. The Sabbath is a day that is God-centered, and our activities upon the Sabbath ought to be God-centered. Now, that doesn't mean that you just have to hide in a closet and pray and study from sunset to sunset. Spend 24 hours. Don't sleep, don't eat, don't fellowship, don't do anything, just, keeping it holy. Well, that's not all that is involved in terms of what it means to keep it holy. Now, it certainly ought to be a day for extra prayer and extra Bible study. It ought to be a time that is especially meaningful in terms of drawing close to God. The emphasis of the Sabbath ought to be as a time to especially draw close to God. In Isaiah chapter 58, we're given some important insight of principles concerning keeping the Sabbath. Isaiah 58:13, it says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my Sabbath day, my holy day, you call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shall honor Him, not doing your own ways or finding your own pleasure, nor speaking your own words. Then shall you delight yourself in the Lord, and I'll cause you to ride upon the high places of the earth and feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Eternal has spoken it. So we're told that the Sabbath is a day that we're not to trample all over. So you turn away your foot from the Sabbath. Mr. Park made reference in the sermonette to what it means to keep something holy, and he talked about Moses pulling his shoes off. God said, the ground you're standing on is holy ground. Don't be stomping all over it with your old dirty shoes, Moses. This is holy ground. In effect, he says the same thing in Isaiah 58. He says, this is holy time. Don't be stomping around all over it with your old dirty shoes. This is holy time. Turn away your foot from the Sabbath. and from doing your pleasure on my Sabbath. Now, some have made great, well, we've had people who've gone to two extremes on this, misunderstanding. Some have said, oh, you're not to do your pleasure. And so from that, they have extrapolated 39 rules. Anything that makes you smile, you shouldn't do. You know, I'm maybe slightly exaggerating, but the concept that anything that would in any way constitute pleasure, because it says don't do your own pleasure. Others have gone to the other extreme. They have looked up, perhaps in other translations, and they have seen that it says, don't do your business. Because that is a very common translation. I think that's the way it's translated in the Jewish translation. So we'll see, I can do anything except my regular business. As long as I'm not doing my business, it doesn't matter. Well, yes it does. The word that's translated here, your pleasure or your business, is a word that means both. You see, the word business does not just mean your employment. It means doing your activities, pursuing your own activities, your own endeavors. The Sabbath is not a day to pursue your own everyday interests and endeavors and activities. You know, it's not a day to use the modern, if you really wanted to give it a modern translation that would perhaps sum up the meaning more than any other one phrase that I know, it says, don't do your own thing. Don't do your own thing. That would probably be the most accurate translation. It maybe be a little bit of a slang translation, but it gives the sense because that's literally what the original word means. It's not a day. It's not restricted to just your business, nor does it just simply mean, well, if it's enjoyable, don't do it. Well, he says you're to call the Sabbath a delight. The point is that it's not a day to pursue your own interests, your own endeavors, to pursue your own pleasures. You know, it's certainly not the day to be sitting around, whatever, you know, going off to the ball game or prop back a Friday evening watching. I don't even know what's on television on Friday evening, but I am sure that some do. Perhaps some of you do. Of course, there are various ways of knowing what's on. Maybe you just read it in the newspaper out of curiosity, or you saw it advertised some other time of the week. But the point is, that's not keeping the Sabbath holy. Now, a question comes up, well, is it a sin to watch television on the Sabbath? Depends. Now, it depends. Now, I don't think it's a sin to watch the World Tomorrow program. In some areas, it comes on Sabbath. Is there anything wrong with turning on the World Tomorrow on the Sabbath? Well, no, I don't see where there's anything wrong with turning on the World Tomorrow on the Sabbath. Many locales, it comes on Saturday, and others, most places, it comes on Sunday. Depends on when we can get the time and what seems to be the best time slot available. Is it wrong to maybe turn on and watch the television news and see if, Jerusalem has been gassed or Baghdad has been nuked or something? No, I don't think particularly so. There's anything necessarily wrong with that. But when you get in terms of spending the day, or using it in terms of simply entertainment, of treating it like any other day, if you're talking about, now we have morning service, so that kind of knocks in the head the bulk of, you can't go to church and lay up and watch all the Saturday morning cartoons, but I guess over in Baton Rouge they could, because they have afternoon services. I'm sure they're early morning, Saturday morning cartoons. I don't know when they're, what's on or when they're on, or whether the ones that were on 26 or 27 years ago, the last time I saw any, are still on or not. I don't know. I haven't really inquired. It hasn't been any major concern of mine. But that's not really keeping the Sabbath holy. I think we can understand that. Now, here, you couldn't watch the cartoons. You could go home and watch the ball game all afternoon. That really wouldn't be keeping the Sabbath holy either. Sometimes people want to get real specific. Well, what about this program? This is a nature program, or this is Now, what do you mean by that? Is that a ball game where you see the grass or something, or what? I don't propose to give any 39, specifics in terms of defining and what constitutes, something that's righteous and something that's not. God states the principle very clearly. And it's a matter as to whether we're after the spirit of the law or whether we're trying to figure a way to wrangle around. Well, what if I program the elevator where the buttons are automatically pushed, This is the kind of extreme, the things that I read at the beginning of the sermon, this is the kind of extremes that people get to when they try to keep coming up with all sorts of humanly devised things. The basic point is it's a day to keep holy. It means that it ought to be a God-centered day, a day that's dedicated to God. Certainly there ought to be time for extra prayer and Bible study. It's not a time to pursue our own interests, our own endeavors, our own activities. It's a time to go to church. That's one part of keeping it holy. Back in Leviticus chapter 23, we're told, these are the feasts of the eternal which you shall proclaim, even my festivals, here in Leviticus chapter 23. The Eternal spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, concerning the feasts of the eternal, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done. The 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. So we're told that the Sabbath is a holy convocation. That means it's a day that we're to convoke or assemble together with other of God's people. We're to attend Sabbath services. That's obviously a part of keeping the Sabbath holy. Now, sometimes the question comes up, well, what about children? And again, you have different extremes. I've heard some over the years say, well, my kids aren't converted, and so you can't really expect them to keep the Sabbath. And what they meant by that was if the kid wanted to go to the ball game or play basketball on Friday night or just, pursue any particular thing that anybody else in the world might be doing, well, hey, my kid's not converted. I mean, what do you mean? You can't really expect him to keep the Sabbath. Well, why not? God expected ancient Israel to keep it, and none of them were converted either, were they? You go back and find what God did to the Israelites that went out and flagrantly broke it. He expected them to do it, so you don't have to be converted to keep the Sabbath in a physical sense. Now, that's one extreme. Say, well, he's not converted, so he doesn't need to keep it. The other extreme is one so as to go to such an extreme as not to recognize that a child is a child. And so in some few cases, I don't think we've had too many of those, but I think in some few cases, people have gone to such extremes that they, instead of the Sabbath being made a delight for the child, the Sabbath was this horrible time where basically all you can do is sit and breathe. And that's not what God intended either. God does not intend for us to go to extremes. Now, at different times in man's history, man tends to go to extremes. In different times in man's history, the tendency has been to go to one extreme or the other. I think in our age, the tendency is most commonly the permissive dish, the liberal side, the permissive side. That is the most frequent because that is the nature of our society. That doesn't mean certain individuals don't go to the other extreme. And in other periods of man's history, that has been the predominant extreme. It's just a matter, perhaps we emphasize the avoidance of the ditch that is the most common. But in reality, of course, we want to avoid both ditches, both extremes, the extreme of the Pharisees as well as the extreme of the libertines. Now, the Sabbath our children can certainly learn to keep the Sabbath, at least in a physical sense, in a sense that appropriate to their ages. What a 5 or 6 year old child is going to do on the Sabbath is not the same as what a 25 or 26 year old adult is going to do on the Sabbath. At least, hopefully not. There is a certain amount of common sense comes into play that the Sabbath should be made special. It can be utilized that there are sometimes games that can be utilized. Either there are Bible games that are available. There are many that can be that can be just simply invented and played. I remember one that I used to play with my children when they were very small. I called it Tic-Tac-No. It was like tic-tac-toe, We just drew it very simple. You don't even have to be an artist to do it. You don't have any elaborate equipment. If you can draw a tic-tac-toe board, you can do that. And then I would ask them a question. And you had to get the question right in order to make your move. And we would ask them questions. Of course, you make the questions appropriate to them and to their ages. It can be fun. It can be a time that you can use it to do some things with them that way, or to maybe to tell them or read to them Bible stories, again depending on their age. It doesn't mean you just make them sit there for 3 hours at a stint while you wade laboriously word by word, but it can be a time to utilize with your children in teaching them about God and in helping them to relate to an understanding of God and God's creation, whether it involves maybe taking them for a walk. Now, how long a walk is appropriate for the Sabbath? Well, I'll tell you what, my boys are 16 and 18, and we take walks a lot of times on Friday evening. We take longer walks than we did when they were 3 and 5. Because what would have been labor for them when they were 3 years old and their little short legs, really wouldn't hardly be noticed when they're, 16 or 18 and taller than I am. And their stride's longer than mine, so we got to pace it now that it's not too hard on Dad. They can tell you about that, but the point obviously is that what we do with our children is tailored to their ages. The things that we teach them, the way that we teach them and work with them, the things that we do. The thing that we sought to do with our children from an early age is to teach them that the Sabbath is different than every other day of the week. The Sabbath is special. We've normally made it... We don't normally have desserts at home after meals, but we have normally made it a point over the years that Friday evening is the one evening that Friday evening is an evening that we will normally always have something special, some sort of a treat, because the Sabbath is different. The Sabbath is special. The Sabbath stands out in a sort of a special way. There are various ways of doing things. It depends obviously on the age of your children, depends on some of the circumstances. The point is, though, that you can work with your children to make it special. And while a small child may be allowed to run around a little bit in the backyard and kind of wear off some energy, that is one thing, and being out running up and down the street playing with the neighbor kids for the whole afternoon is something totally different. That the Sabbath was viewed as a special time, as a different time. Some of their toys, certain things we may have allowed them to play with on the Sabbath that we kind of saved for the Sabbath. It was something that was special, something that they enjoyed, and something that was Sabbath related. I think you want to try and make it special and relate it to them on a level of understanding that they can understand. You make it special, and yet it should be distinct and different from every other day of the week. And even a small child can understand this is the Sabbath. This day is different. This day is God's day. This is special. And as we may place certain restrictions on their behavior, there should also be certain opportunities and certain things that are extra and that are special that give a specialness. That while there are things God tells us not to do, there are also things God tells us to do. I think one of the things that children often enjoy the very most is simply the fact that their parents have some time and attention for them. Parents have some extra time and attention to spend with them, and I think that's important and appropriate because God says we should spend time with and teach our children. The exact way you do it depends with the age of the child, but we as adults should strive to keep the Sabbath holy, to make it special. and to recognize that it's God's day, and whether it involves using it for fellowship, as a time to spend some time visiting with other brethren or something of that sort, that they're, as long as it's done in balance and in an appropriate way, that's wonderful. We should think in terms of how to properly organize and schedule our time on the Sabbath to get the maximum use out of it. A lot of times when people first start coming into the church and they find out about the Sabbath, they think, what in the world will I ever do? I have all this time, I won't know what to do. I think for most of us who've been in the church for a while, the question is not what do I do to fill up the time? The question is it's here and gone. It goes so quickly. How can I get more in to the Sabbath? Because it is a time that is to be remembered. It is to be kept holy. Also, we're told that in it we are to do no work. This brings us to something that is very important. And that is the preparation day. Now that often gets lost sight of, but one of the important things about keeping the Sabbath starts the day before. That's why the 6th day of the week is called the day of preparation. The preparation day. That's a time to get, if you're going to be ready to observe the Sabbath, when the Sabbath comes on, then the preparation day needs to have been organized in an efficient way as to where you're ready to relax and to enjoy the Sabbath. There are many things that we can do ahead of time. Clothes can be prepared ahead of time and gotten ready. Sometimes at least certain things about meals can be. That doesn't mean you have to pour your cornflakes on Friday afternoon and put the milk on them and set them on the table, where you avoid all work. They might be a little bit soggy by Saturday morning. That is not really what God is talking about. I think we can understand a certain amount of balance and perspective. But on the other hand, there are things that may, a lot of our cooking may simply involve, turning the knob on the stove and letting something warm up, or putting something in a microwave and punching a couple of buttons, and a few minutes later you hear a little ding and it's hot and it's ready. That doesn't really involve a whole lot of work and labor. That's not real labor intensive. And the fact of pushing the button and whether or not some generator somewhere is running, and look, the generator's running whether you push the button or not. Nobody is doing an extra minute's worth of labor on your behalf, and if you don't do anything all day, they're not going to lay anybody off at the power plant. They're not, it's not going to make any difference to what the world is doing. That's not, turning on the light switch or not turning it on is really sort of irrelevant in the overall scheme of things. That's not what is talked about. In fact, if you really go back and examine in detail what it's talking about of kindling a fire, the fire that it has reference to, they were in the process of building the tabernacle, and it really had to do with a smelting fire. It had to do with certain things as far as the smelting of metals for the tabernacle, and some things that were involved of keeping the smelting fire going, and God didn't want them involving themselves with those things on the Sabbath. But by starting a fire, kindling a fire, you're talking about going out and chopping down a tree, cutting it up into manageable sizes, splitting the firewood, and coming in and laying a fire, and sitting there and rubbing two sticks together until you finally get a blaze. I would say that does constitute work. You don't have to do all of that, but most of us, that's where preparation comes in, so that the amount that actually needs doing on the Sabbath is very, very minor. That there are a lot of things that can be done ahead of time, even the extra preparation in terms of meals. If you're talking about taking a couple of slices of bread and putting them in the toaster, that's one thing. If you're talking about making several loaves of whole wheat bread from scratch, that's something else. It is a point of common sense that comes in, not a matter of a restrictive list. Well, how many minutes and how many seconds can you spend in the kitchen before it becomes work? That kind of misses the point of the whole thing. God says that, it's a day, the preparation day is a day to make preparation. Whether it involves clothes, whether it involves heavy cooking or preparation as far as meals or shopping, to stop by the store and pick up a bunch of items. Well, we don't have any so and so or any of this or that, and so I better stop by the store and get it. Well, that's really a matter of a lack of preparation. I think we have to realize that there's a little bumper sticker I saw one time that said a lack of planning, bad planning on your part doesn't necessarily constitute an emergency on mine. There ought to be some planning. I realize sometimes there are things that come up that can't be foreseen, just like gassing up the car on the preparation day. That's something we normally do every Friday afternoon because I know I'm going to be coming over here, and therefore I like to have a full tank of gas and be ready to go. Over the course of 20 years in the ministry, there may have been 1 or 2 days where some emergency came up on a Friday afternoon that interfered or that prohibited my having gassed up the car at a time that I would have expected. I can remember once or twice somebody was seriously injured. I got called out and going down to meet them at a hospital or something on a Friday afternoon. Wound up there for several hours. There are obviously things that will come up, but they will come up very infrequently if you're careful with your planning. And realize that's one of the things God wants us to learn with a preparation day is to be prepared. God uses a preparation day. This is, in terms of God's overall 7,000-year plan, this is the preparation day. And God is using this period as a time of preparation for the millennial Sabbath. We should utilize it and examine what we do so that we're not just so exhausted by sunset that all we can do is lay down and quiver for 24 hours. It's a matter of common sense, and it's a matter of trying to apply the principle and the spirit of the law. Obviously, there are times that an emergency can come up. Somebody becomes unexpectedly ill or sick. Something happens. Christ talked about the ox or the sheep falling in the ditch. When you get him out, that's right. But if the ox is in the ditch every Sabbath, then maybe you ought to take some time during the week to fix the fence. The ox may wander out and he may get in the ditch on occasion, but it's pretty good indication that you don't have it very well fenced. And if he's getting in the ditch every Sabbath, then go in during the week and fix the fence. And then you won't have to worry about him getting into the ditch every Sabbath. So it is a matter that some planning needs to be done. Even with the best planning, there will sometimes be a circumstance that comes up. Now, let's notice one other principle that relates to this in Exodus 34, because I think it can add in an understanding of what is not an emergency. Exodus 34:21, it says, 6 days shall you work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. In earing time and in harvest you shall rest. Now, this is addressed to people in an agrarian society, but the principle holds true. He says you're to rest on the 7th day. And then he specifically says, in earing time and in harvest time you shall rest. Now, any of you farmers realize there are certain times of the year that are very hectic. Very hectic. God specifically singled those out and says, even those times you still observe the Sabbath. It doesn't constitute an emergency just because you're busy. I can Remember, for instance, as a boy growing up, my dad raised beef cattle, and during the period of the summer when we were cutting hay and getting hay put up for the winter, that was a hectic time. And you had to time it in terms of the weather, because what you didn't want was bales of hay all over your field, and it raining on those bales of hay, because you could ruin a lot of hay and really be in trouble. Now, people say, well, boy, it's got a lot of hay in the field, and so looks kind of like rain. I guess even though it's the Sabbath, I better go out and get the hay out of the field. The ox is in the ditch. Well, no, that's not an ox in the ditch. That's really a matter of very poor planning, because you don't. You obviously cut off baling early enough in the day that you can clean up and get put away what you have, and then you come back on Sunday and start over. You have to do some planning to bring work to a halt early enough to put up after. This is what it's talking about. In harvest time and in earing time, you shall rest. You don't just do something, leave it out, and create your own emergency as a result of either total lack of planning or very poor planning. That doesn't constitute an emergency. That just constitutes poor planning. God says we need to utilize some planning. We should not plan an emergency. An emergency, by definition, is something that's unplanned. The ox may get in the ditch, but you shouldn't leave the gate open for him to do so. And the principle there of the ox in the ditch is it involved. One of the major things it involved was suffering to a living creature, as well as, of course, the loss of property. And there are other principles here that illustrate the fact that it's a time we're not to do work. We are to utilize a preparation day. Yes, emergencies may arise, but normally they're going to arise very infrequently if we're trying to be careful. And if we have not been careful, then we need to examine that, and we need to go to God for forgiveness and for the help to learn the lessons and to be properly prepared, to focus in on remembering this day that God set as a memorial of the creation, as well as a memorial of the time in the future when the government of God is going to hold sway over this whole earth. It is a time for us to remember, for us to look backward and to look forward. It is a time for us to keep holy, to realize it's special. It ought to be utilized in terms of drawing close to God as an individual and as a family, to seek to use it in an appropriate way as a special time, and certainly to make it so for our children, recognizing, of course, what is appropriate to them for their age and understanding as to the exact specifics of how we implement it. It's not a day for work and labor, but we are to utilize the time of the preparation day to make preparation, to be prepared, to get things in order. Yet we recognize that there will be times that an emergency may arise. But again, normally if we're doing our part, those emergencies will not be frequent. They will be just that. They will be emergencies. They will be things that have come up that catches us unawares, and that we have to deal with in that way. Let's just notice in Isaiah chapter 66, final chapter here in the book of Isaiah, focuses in on the time of God's government in the future. Isaiah 66:1, "Thus says the Eternal, the heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. Where is the house that you build unto me? Where is the place of my rest? All those things is my hand made, and all those things have been, says the Eternal. But to this man will I look, to him that is poor and of a contrite spirit, and that trembles at my word." Somebody who really has that eager anticipation. Again, sometimes people misunderstand what it means to tremble at God's word. Some have only the connotation of sitting there quivering in fright. You're afraid God's going to get you. But any of you who've ever gone hunting with dogs, you understand that there's another meaning of quivering. You have a bird dog sitting there, and he's just quivering with anticipation for you to give the signal for him to go. And this is what God's talking about. Trembles at my word. Somebody that has that eager expectation and anticipation. We're so keyed up. And that have that eager anticipation, that eagerness for God's Word and God's truth. We desire to have God's Word fulfilled in our lives. We're not looking for loopholes. We're not trying to reason around. We're not trying to strain out a gnat and swallow a camel, as Christ told the Pharisees they were doing. We have an approach that is God-centered and God-oriented, and that we want and we eagerly anticipate God's law being fulfilled in us through God's help, the power of His Spirit. As we come on down here toward the end of Isaiah 66, talking about the time of the world tomorrow, when God is going to regather Israel and bring them back to Jerusalem. And in verse 21 of Isaiah 66, he says, I will also take of them for priests and for Levites, says the Eternal. And as the new heavens and the new earth, which I will make, shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it'll come to pass from one new moon to another, from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, says the Lord. All flesh, all humanity. Not merely the Jew or the Israelite, but all humanity will come before God. All flesh shall come to worship before the eternal God. We look forward to a time in the world tomorrow when the whole human race will be united in allegiance and worship to the great God. God has called us out and given us insight and given us understanding to recognize His calling and His plan and His purpose today. We need to value that, to appreciate that, to utilize it, to appreciate and value the Sabbath, which God has given to His people as a sacred sign, to identify us as a perpetual covenant, to identify us as His people. We look back to the time of creation and memorialize the Creator, and we look forward to the time in the future when the whole earth is at rest and under the rule of the Messiah, when all flesh will go forth every Sabbath to worship the eternal, the Lord of hosts.